about imperialism in Asia. Um, Now, it went down a little bit differently than it did in Africa because the Asian countries were a little strong and certainly didn't always get conquered. But we'll take a look. So, um, it starts a little bit earlier in China with the Opium Wars with Britain. Now, these, when you look at them in light of today, it's so horrifying what happened. But basically, the British were selling opium to China, and their population was becoming addicted. And the Manchu dynasty was, or the Qing dynasty was feeling this was weakening them and causing trouble. So they told the British to stop. And then eventually, kind of like a Boston Tea Party thing, caused some trouble. The British, in retaliation, bombarded several coastal cities and forced China to surrender and make all these concessions. This would be like Venezuela or Colombia, one of the drug cartels beating up the United States because we were, practicing the war on drugs. So with the Treaty of Nanking, this is how Hong Kong ends up as British, which you still have legacies of today. And these treaty ports are open to trade, and basically they grant them extraterritoriality, which means that they're not subject to Chinese law, which again further weakens the Qing dynasty. And imagine if we couldn't try another country's citizens for crimes against Americans. So this happens again. There's a second Opium War over the same issues. And this forces them to open 6 more ports. And again, it's more humiliation and really just begins to show the downfall of China. All of this weakening of the Qing dynasty leads to one of the bloodiest rebellions in world history, the Taiping Rebellion. And again, they're opposed to the Manchus, same name as the Qing dynasty. Eventually it's put down, but 20 million people died. Just, put that in perspective. It's a bloody thing. Now, the Europeans then in parts of China, they established what they call spheres of influence. And so it's not quite conquering the whole country, but they began to have these places that, you sort of control. A few years back, when we adopted my daughter from China, we actually stayed at one of these old ones. It's called Shamian Island, and it's off the coast of Guangzhou in southern China. And it was this little island when you left main Guangzhou, and it felt like this enclave of like some Western, like British city in the midst of China. This is back in 2002. But ultimately, that's kind of what's going on. And then Japan, there's a Sino-Japanese war. We'll get into Japanese modernization in a little bit. But Japan begins to get concessions, and really, China's just getting carved up. Again, the specifics here, France gets their piece of Canton Bay. Russia's grabbing Manchuria. But ultimately, you can sort of see the pattern. And here is a cartoon from the time, and it basically shows these stereotypes of the Europeans, and they are carving up China. And what will they do? And of course, the number of racist stereotypes you see here is what it is. But that's kind of the point. Now, if you look at the Chinese empire here, you can begin to see the spheres of influence. And again, this isn't the same thing as conquering the country, but certainly not great for the Manchus holding on to power. Now, the U.S. is not quite as egregious as everyone else. So our policy is what's called the open door. And we just want that we're trying to keep conflict from happening. So we want the Europeans to agree not to fight with each other over the issue of China. And again, it sounds better than it was. Now, India is the big enchilada, certainly for the British. And one of their most important colonies, We've talked about the Mughals before. Sometimes you spell it this way, Mughal, but that falls apart in the 17th century. After the 7 Years' War, which we've read about, it's called the French and Indian War in American history. The British eventually take control of the last native state in India um, in 1848, and that is going to set up trouble. So you can see British India in red. Today, it's what Pakistan and India and Bangladesh, but that is a story for another time when they get independence in 1948. But one of the big episodes happens here is the Sepoy Mutiny. The Sepoy Mutiny happens where they basically had this new gun cartridge. So you had to basically tear it with your teeth and pour the bullet in the gunpowder. And the rumor spread amongst the Hindu troops that there was animal fat in the greasing on the cartridges. And that was enough to cause them to rebel, because you can't eat pork or animals or cows and such in either religion, because it's Muslims and Hindus in India. And so anyway, but basically there's short and long term causes. Now, after 1858, this rebellion's put down. There's some pretty horrible atrocities, but then the British take direct control of India, and it's really done by a small civil service in India, but they train a lot of native Indians to do a lot of this work for them. So some of the things they do, and it's not all bad. Progressive secondary education, lots of economic projects, cotton industry, and things like that. And actually, because they need native Indians to run India, they end up creating something called the Indian National Congress. And this actually educates Indians, and it eventually is going to form this cadre that's going to be able to agitate for independence. Now, British have some other colonies going on. Again, the sun never sets. So you got Burma, the Malay Peninsula, North Borneo. Now, France, they have Indochina. Now, Indochina for them is today it's modern day Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And you still see legacies of this. I was in Vietnam over Christmas, and you still see legacies of this. And they become this protectorate in the South Seas, and they take on Tahiti and New Caledonia, just some other places on the map. I'm going to do a little bit of a digression here and show you guys a picture of some coins I picked up when I was in Vietnam over Christmas break. And what you can see are the Indochina coins, and they just would do their own coinage, kind of mixing and matching, and I got these in a souvenir shop. So the coinage obviously changed, but from 1879 to 1947, the French were running the show. So how do the Asian countries respond? Nobody is just taking all this laying down. So in China, the Boxer Rebellion is in 1900. It's this uprising, Chinese nationalists, and it takes this multinational force going in and to put it down, but just lots more death. And eventually the Manchu dynasty falls in 1911. And so here you can see some of the Boxers, pretty bloody stuff. Now, and there's some more picture of the multinational force. Ultimately, Sun Yat-sen, who's this revolutionary, he tries to overthrow the Manchu dynasty and start a republic. And this is the beginnings of Chinese nationalism that we will get into later. Now we're going to digress, and I'm going to do a separate lecture on Japan, because that is a fascinating story in of itself. Now, not everybody in Europe was in favor of imperialism. There was lots of opposition to it. So Karl Marx claimed that the bourgeoisie, the rich people, needed to constantly expand and would lead to conquest. And then J.A. Hobson, or B.J.A. Hobson, he said that, well, the colonies were only there to provide new markets, and it wasn't for any other good purpose. It was all money. And that the business and bankers, it's this conspiracy to cause things. And if you basically would raise wages for workers, this would lead to more consumption of goods at home, and you wouldn't have to have these markets. And then he's influential in increasing anti-imperialism. Socialisms buy into it. And then Lenin saw it as leading to colonial rivalries and war. And that, in fact, was the case when we get into causes of World War I. So to sum up, here's what you can say, right? These are the places Britain gets. These are the places France gets. Here you can see Germany. And really, the legacy of the world is still today. Just as an example, when the Belgians are in West Africa, they colonized two places, Rwanda, or actually East Africa, Rwanda and Burundi. And there are two tribes there, Hutus and Tutsis. And the Belgians basically put the Tutsis in charge, even though they're minority. That causes resentment among the Hutus. And in 1994, that leads to the genocide that kills 1 million people in those two countries. So we still have a lot of legacy of this. When I was in South Africa in 2018 and Zimbabwe, the thing that surprised me was how little Americans and Westerners know about Africa, and how many different ethnic groups there are, and just how, within South Africa there are many, and within Zimbabwe. And, when we hear Africa, we just tend to think of it all as one place.